On Mondays, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby. Michelle Pearse, the CEO of the Australian Christian Lobby, joining us. Hey, Michelle, welcome back to 2020.
Hi, Neil. Thanks for having me again.
Michelle, let's talk about one of those really important pieces of proposed legislation called the Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. These sorts of laws are being debated. What are your overall concerns here?
We have many concerns. The bill, just for people's knowledge, it's called the Communication Legislation Amendment Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill. And we're really concerned with the definitions that they've given to serious harm. The scope is very wide. And it can include a lot of the things that we as the ACL post and generally things that Christians post about their views on things like gender and sexuality. But it's not just Christians that their freedom of speech is under threat. The scope for serious harm is so wide that it includes things said about electoral processes, which can include just political opinions, public health, and the definition for physical injury includes things like causing offence to the LGBTQ community. So how that causes physical injury, it could lead to that, I'm not sure. But we are really concerned with the scope of this bill.
And I guess right from the outset, if you're talking about this bill, when you say, what does this mean for the Christian community, for church leaders, for Christians in the workplace, there's all sorts of effects there that flow on, particularly if you hold a biblical view on a whole lot of the controversial issues. And as I understand it, Michelle, even the explanatory memorandum is something like 142 pages. So this is not a two-page bill that's easy to get your head around. There's a lot of complexities in this one.
That's right. It is 142 pages. I sat down and I read it in a day. I was quite proud of myself. But I was quite shocked to see the content. And at face value, you could think, okay, well, maybe there is some benefit in limiting some of the misinformation and disinformation online. But when you dig down and you actually read the kinds of explanations they give to their definitions of serious harm, that's where the real problem is. And things like within harm to electoral processes, well, you think, well, people shouldn't be able to tell somebody to vote in a different location and mislead the voter in that way. But it includes political opinions about politicians. And one of the examples they provide is if a female leader has been promiscuous, that shouldn't be allowed to be a post online. And even the way that information is verified is also compromised. So it's not an independent fact-checking, could be deemed misinformation, fact-checked by an unaccountable, compromised bureaucrat, could be deemed as misinformation and taken off the platforms. It limits discussion about public health. We know that in COVID, there were some things that were labelled misinformation that have now been revealed as truth. And although it's not an issue that ACL actively campaigns on, there is benefit in putting opinions and having freedom of discussion, because it actually leads to the discovery of truth. And I think it also has implications on, the free will that we've been given by God to find truth. And when the public opinions are censored and we're not allowed to post certain things and things get taken down, it limits our ability, and the general population limits their ability to choose between what they accept and what they reject.
Interesting, isn't it? Because while we think about truth and think that everybody knows what's objective about that, really the truth often emerges because there is sometimes even tensions in the debate. You have to have a debate to actually appreciate and understand truth. And then, then you can either choose to accept or reject that. And sometimes that happens along ideological lines, but sometimes you've got to have the debate to establish what truth is. And so this seems to be something that would try to stymie that debate.
Exactly right. And the Australian Communications and Media Authority, they're the ones who will define the misinformation standard. And it's crazy because they've given the social media companies the chance to create their own code. But if ACMA determines that their code is insufficient, then ACMA will create the standard. And, it's kind of like asking your kids to create a rule. And if their rule, perhaps for their own behaviour, if their rule doesn't go far enough, then you create your standard. And so essentially it's a little bit patronising, I think, to the social media companies to say, well, you create your code, but if it's not good enough, then we'll create the standard that you have to abide by. And further to that, the fine for non-compliance is 2 to 5% of the social media company's annual turnover. So of course the social media companies will over-censor because they don't want to be fined that amount. And so over-censorship will naturally be a consequence of this bill.
We all don't like when bad stuff happens on social media, but you've got a government now saying we'll protect you by censoring what happens on social media, and when the censorship happens around those things which are legitimate, debate points in a pursuit of truth, we've got a challenge there, and we've got something that looks very black when it comes to the way that governments can abuse that.
That's right, and there's no penalty for over-censorship, which is another point. So there's only a penalty for failing to remove posts that contain mis and disinformation, and it goes further to just removing posts to things like, when you search for an organisation online, Google Analytics can demote your ratings and things like that if they deem you're a risk to mis and disinformation. So sometimes you won't even know that this is happening. You won't know your posts are being taken down. So it's all operating kind of behind the scenes, but censoring what people get to see and what they don't get to see.
Michelle, as I understand it, submissions are about to close, or have they closed, on this Misinformation and Disinformation Bill? Is it too late for listeners today to make their own submission?
Today's the last day, that they can make their submission. So we've actually got an online tool that can help you to make your submission. So I encourage you to go to the Take Action page on our website to do that. But if you do want to put more thought and construct your arguments yourself, you can ask for an extension. We've done that ourselves. We're asking for an extension. So we've got more time to get through the explanatory memorandum to ensure that our comment is well informed as well. So they should grant you an extension. However, they only gave a total of 11 days before the submission process ended, which really is undemocratic. It just shows, even from the outset, that they're not really interested in listening to public opinion on this.
Does that mean that there's some sort of a fast tracking of this bill, do you think? If that's an indicator, if it's a short-term way that they'll be seeking submissions, is this an indicator that this may be something that's being fast-tracked?
Yes, absolutely. So the Minister have said that they want to pass it before the end of the year. And so the committee is due to report on November 25, and that leaves one more sitting week in the parliamentary calendar. So it's likely that they'll rush it through in that last week. So we're doing whatever we can behind the scenes to ensure that, especially those with the, in the middle, in the Senate, that we're able to convince them not to support it, or at least heavily amend it. And the coalition have come out saying they'll oppose it. So that's one positive move.
Well, the ACL website, to find a link about how you can make a submission today, the last day. So a little bit of pressure on. Can't put this one off until tomorrow. Your opportunity, go to the ACL website, acl.org.au. Look for a link there where you can make your submission. Hey, let's turn a little bit of attention to South Australia, Michelle. The abortion bill has been introduced about limiting late-term abortions. What can you tell us about the activity in South Australia?
Yeah, there's a move in the right direction, and it is a world first bill to wind back extreme late-term abortion. It's the first kind of bill of its kind. For listeners who aren't aware, we have abortion to birth in every state in Australia. It's a terrible situation where we're one of the worst nations in the whole world when it comes to abortion. So this amendment aims to ensure that babies delivered in the third trimester, so that's after 27 weeks, are delivered alive through an induced birth rather than a stillborn. after, killing the baby in utero. So babies, the majority of babies, I think it's 96% actually do survive if they're delivered in the third trimester. So the question is, why does this baby have to die? And it was instigated after 45 healthy and fully formed babies have been killed after these abortion laws were passed in 2022. And so this is an essential bill. We need to wind this back. We're hoping and believing for its success, which we can then hopefully replicate in other states in Australia.
Well, as Christians, of course, we know that life starts at conception, and these abortion laws have evolved in so many of our states and territories around Australia to the point where even those viable babies that would be born, would live a long and healthy life outside of the womb. There is this late-term abortion that's happening so much right around Australia, but as we're focusing on South Australia right now, and can I be a little bit graphic here for a moment, because I know that the Liberal MP in South Australia, Ben Hood, suggests that not too many people know about the full extent of pregnancy terminations and practices that are happening in his state. But as I understand it, when we're talking about these late-term abortions, and I'll get your feeling, Michelle, late-term abortions whereby sodium chloride is injected into the heart of an unborn baby through the uterus, stopping the heart before birth. The baby is subsequently stillborn, sometime shortly afterwards, either by induction of labour or by a C-section. So abortion, as tragic and as horrific and as brutal as it is, some babies survive. They're the ones who are missing out on any support when their life is viable. This is why I guess you can get a little bit emotional about this, but what are your thoughts when there is this brutality of abortion, when those babies are viable?
It's barbaric. And I think any reasonable Australian would agree that this is barbaric. The majority of Australians don't support late-term abortion, and especially when you carry through with the description as you just did then, Neil, it's terrible what these babies go through. The fact that they're not provided any pain relief as well, and these sorts of procedures do cause pain for the unborn baby as well. And further to this, there's trauma on the mother who goes through that traumatic experience of delivering a dead child after this lethal injection. So there are plenty of couples that want to adopt babies. There's a shortage of babies that are up for adoption in Australia, and yet we're killing these viable babies rather than giving them a chance to live in a loving home of parents who want a baby. So if this doesn't pass, it's a real stain on the South Australian Parliament. But we believe there is a realistic chance, given a conscience vote, that this will pass.
Just quickly, jumping to another state in Queensland, because I want to come back to South Australia, but a Queensland committee has rejected protecting babies surviving abortions. That one, Robbie Katter introduced a Babies Born Alive bill, but now a parliamentary committee's rejected the idea of even looking out for those babies born alive. That, again, something similar, is tragic, and it's happening in the state of Queensland.
Exactly. And there is an acknowledgement around Australia that babies do survive abortions. But as soon as the committee and opponents of protecting these babies conflate the issue with abortion, well suddenly not caring for these babies or not providing them life-sustaining care is justified because, in their words, because it's an abortion. And so we're continually trying to separate the two. This is about abortion, even though it's an abortion that creates this situation. But the killing is never justified, no matter what the intent is of the circumstances surrounding that baby's birth. The baby is still a live human being. But the inquiry in itself has led to further changes to Queensland health guidelines, so that's a positive thing, to actually bolster care for babies who survive abortions. But they've kind of used that as a justification for not putting in the legislative protections. But our stance continues to be that without real legislative accountability, Queensland Health can just modify its guidelines. And so as an issue, that's as serious as this, there needs to be legislative protections, such as there already is in South Australia and New South Wales, where babies who survive abortions are protected in law.
What's happening in Queensland, what would happen in a number of those states and territories, too little and never enough. And when you've got a chance to speak up, that's when you've got to take that opportunity while it is there. Hey, let's come back to South Australia, because they've had a whole lot of ethical issues before their parliament. They're going through a process too around conversion therapy. In fact, it's passed in South Australia, as I understand it.
That's right. It passed in 1 week with the government block vote and with the support of the Greens. And again, this is one of those sort of domino effect bills that's happening around the states. And the very premise for this bill is just completely wrong. The South Australian Attorney General said that a person's sexuality or their gender identity are immutable characteristics that cannot be changed. So if that's the foundation that this bill is founded upon, then it's not our world view. We're starting, already in a point where we're in disagreement. We believe that sex is an immutable characteristic, the gender you were born with, not your gender identity. And we as Christians would also say that sexuality can be changed. We talk about sexual ethics and self-control and renewing your mind, that if you're in a relationship and you're married, then you do have to have self-control when it comes to your sexuality. And so this is just stating that those temptations, that those things that we struggle with, our sexuality, as well as our, what people can choose to be their gender, are immutable, that can't be changed. It's a terrible law, and one that just shouldn't see the light of day.
Well, we know that our biblical foundation around these sexual ethics is the view that there are only male and female. And what bills like this do is it criminalises parents, criminalises Christians around these issues. So for listeners in South Australia, there'll be an opportunity for you to take some action too, and we'll talk about how you do that shortly, because there's other things going on in South Australia too around prostitution. A bill to protect women exiting prostitution has failed in South Australia. What's happened here?
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. So the ACL has been propagating the Nordic model of prostitution, which is really about criminalising the purchase of sex to show that it's changed the culture that purchasing a woman for sex is immoral and is exploitation. But then also to help the women in prostitution to escape. And so this is through sort of government funded exit programs to help these women to get out of prostitution. And so when the Nordic model failed to pass in South Australia, the Honourable Nicola Centofanti then, watered down the bill, but still was a good bill to just help these women, to just have a bill that would help these women access exit services, and that there would be programs provided to do this. And unfortunately, it failed. I think it was only by one vote in the end. So it did have a lot of parliamentary support, but just not enough to get it over the line.
And there is that Nordic or equality model that you've been now a champion of at the Australian Christian Lobby for a number of years, and it takes a long time for these things to filter through into legislation, but I know there'll be some optimism that there are some incremental changes, or at least things are being talked about to do things in a different way that will preserve the dignity of women and put an end to some of this exploitation and trafficking that happens in the prostitution industry. Hey, there's been some really important conversations around these that we're having today. Some listeners who are listening in South Australia, in Queensland, and all over Australia around those misinformation and disinformation laws. Are there links easy to find on the ACL website, Michelle, where listeners who can take some action today can actually do that?
Absolutely. So on the Take Action page of our website, you'll find all of our campaigns there. Some things happen at such pace that, as much as we try to get a campaign up in a day, sometimes it takes a couple of days. But if you're really eager, you can always go online and find your local member and just write to them about your concerns. And even better, go and visit your local member. We are lobbyists and we have some influence, being that the fact that we come from an informed base of knowledge, but you being, within the electorate of your MP, your voice has to be heard in this democratic process. So I really encourage you to contact your MP, pray for them and make your concerns known.
Your voice is important. And when you hear that from Michelle Pearse, and as one of those leading lobbyists, recognising that it's not just the lobbyists who have a responsibility to play here, but it's every single person who has a conscience and understands what a godly position is on so many of these issues, let me point listeners to the ACL website. ACL stands for Australian Christian Lobby, acl.org.au, and look for that action link where you can take action on some of these points. And of course, we really don't have enough time to cover all of the things that are going on around Australia. So no matter what state or territory you're listening to us today, you can find what's going on in your state or your territory and some ways that you can take some action. Michelle Pearse, just wonderful getting your insights. Thank you so much for updating us so wonderfully today on 2020.
Thanks very much.